In 1066, Edward, the last king in the Anglo-Saxon line of kings, died without an heir of the body. The favorite explanation for that is that he had taken a vow of chastity. It's not a good idea for a king to take a vow of chastity because a king is responsible for making sure that there is an heir to the kingdom. But Edward was very holy, and he and his wife agreed that they would maintain chastity. In fact, the tradition says that Edward didn't want to get married at all, but when his advisors came to him and said, "We really need you to get married because, after all, we need an heir," he reluctantly agreed and did marry someone, but made an agreement with her ahead of time that they would live in chastity, which pretty much defeated the goal of his advisors. Anyhow, in 1066 he died with no children. And there were, of course, people ready to leap into the breach. One of them was his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson. Another one was Duke William of Normandy.
Holy Queen, Mother of mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To you do we cry, for banished children of Eve.
Both of these men swore that Edward had promised them the kingdom. And the evidence is that perhaps he did. At different times, he spoke to different people and said, yes, 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 of course they could inherit the kingdom. And then he died, and then they were fighting about it. So between January of 1066 and October, Harold Godwinson ruled England. But in October of 1066, Duke William, now known to us as the Conqueror, brought over his forces, fought off Harold in the south of England at Hastings, at what is now known as Battle Abbey, and won. And so immediately, William rules England and brought all these Normans with him, and they, little by little, Normanized England. They fought especially hard in the north. It was so far from London, so far from the south, that it was harder to conquer the north of England. And that's why there is a discussion that Bernard sent Cistercian monks over to help settle the north of England while the Normans were trying to subdue it. So that's one of the explanations of the Cistercians coming to England in the first place. Although in those first months while Harold was King of England, he had sought to have Edward canonized as a way of giving him a royal saint for his reign, it didn't happen. And so then time went past, and although William did all he could to sort of lay claim to Edward's tradition, although he had himself crowned in Westminster Abbey, which Edward had built, and in fact making sure he and his successors did things like having Edward's crown placed on them at the coronation and having Edward's ring placed on their finger. Nonetheless, it wasn't until 1161, when Henry II was on the throne, that Edward was canonized. He was canonized in 1161. At that time, Henry was in France. So they didn't do the translation of the relics and everything immediately. But while they were waiting for that, Lawrence, the abbot of Westminster, wrote to Aelred and said, "We are going to need a new life of Edward the Confessor. We have an old one that you can use as a model, but we would like you to write the new life, because when Edward the Confessor when his relics are translated to a new shrine, we would like to have a new life that tells about him." And Aelred was apparently invited to preach at the ceremony. So that's October of 1163. Sometime between 1161 and 1163, Aelred wrote this life. This is a case where the dating is very, very clear. Now, the new life was obviously intended to honor Edward as a newly named saint, and that's easy enough. And Aelred is explicit about that and knows the source. He has lots of stories. It's an easy task. But Aelred puts his own twist on this work. He does, in fact, use a number of the stories that his source, the source is by Osbert of Clare, a monk at Westminster. He takes these stories, although he changes them. There's been work done to compare the old versions of the stories and the new versions of the stories, and we can see Aelred's familiar take on these stories in terms of emphasizing monastic virtues, humility, devotion, and this sort of thing. But Aelred is still at this point interested in the question of good government. He's still interested in trying to talk to Henry, who now is not just about to be king, but is in fact a king and has been for some years. Aelred is still concerned to try to talk him into being a good king. He's still trying to anglicize him. He's still trying to give him advice. He gives him moral stories. So even while he's using his source, he's also talking to Henry. And in fact, it can be argued that, well, not just it can be argued, in fact, it's clear that Aelred turns this new life of Edward into a continuing work honoring and directing Henry II. So, at the beginning of the life of Edward the Confessor, of St. Edward, Aelred writes a letter, first of all to Abbot Lawrence, saying, "Thank you for asking me to write this, and thank you for sending me Osbert's life. I appreciate it. I've done what you asked me to do." That would be all that was really necessary. But he adds a second letter, now addressed to, guess who? Henry II. This is maybe the third letter that he has actually written to Henry. And he says to Henry, "Beyond all the civilizations and kingdoms of the earth, England is renowned for the sanctity of her kings." Notice, once again, we're right back to the question of the faith of the English kings. "Among these, the glorious King Edward shone like a surpassing star, giving forth light like the morning star in the mist and like the full moon in its season. His life is, I believe, to be directed to you, most glorious King Henry, so that you may know how great are his merits before God, with whom he now reigns in heaven. In your own time and under your royal authority, Holy Mother Church has judged that he is to be highly exalted on earth. The special renown of our Henry, not Edward, but Henry, is his physical descent from such a holy line." Now, it's important to remember that Henry did not descend from Edward. Edward had no children. He descends from relatives of Henry. But now we're blurring the distinction. His physical descent from such a holy line, we believe that he promised you to us for the consolation of all England. That Edward the Confessor, well before the time of Henry II, promised you to us for the consolation of all England. We have learned that even while dying, he indicated by a prophetic parable that you would act for us. For we rejoice that with you as the cornerstone, the two walls of the English and Norman peoples have met. I find this astonishing that he would address Henry II as the cornerstone. He is intent on using scriptural language to assign to Henry. But he says, "I leave these things to others. Now, most illustrious king, you have assumed the kingdom of your great ancestor." Notice how the language gets blurred here. You have assumed the kingdom of your great ancestor by a twofold right, having merited the kingdom and your aristocratic blood from both your father and your mother. May you commend yourself frequently to his prayers, that is, to Edward's prayers, commit yourself earnestly to his protection, and strive to imitate his sanctity, so that you may obtain eternal happiness with him. Amen. On the one hand, he's flattering Henry. On the other hand, he is sliding Henry into understanding himself as actually a blood descendant of this new saint, and thereby asking him to imitate him, to take his sanctity into himself. So the first thing he praises Edward for, after talking about his childhood of virtue and church-goingness and piety, he talks about once Edward becomes king, one of the most important things about his role is that he is able to bring peace to England. Now, this, of course, is exactly what Henry II had done one way or another when he became king, when the treaty was signed that made him king of England after the 19 years of civil war. So here we have Edward as a model, actually a model in the past. Henry has already followed Edward, so he can admire what Edward has done as an anticipation of his own bringing of peace to England. One of the ways in which Edward brought peace to England was by defeating the Vikings. The Vikings had been a plague to England since the 8th century, burning monasteries, burning in towns, settling in the northeast of England, and little by little threatening to take over all of the country. Edward managed to stamp out their advance, he says. One of the stories he tells, in fact, is that Edward was once in Mass, appropriately, in Mass, and began to laugh. And someone asked him later why he had been laughing. And he said while he was praying, he saw in a vision the King of Denmark on a ship. And he slipped on the ship and fell into the water and was drowned. And so, of course, they checked soon. They sent messages off to Denmark, and they got word back that indeed the king had been killed in exactly that way. Aelred loves this story. He tells it in Genealogy of the Kings of the English, he tells it in the Life of Edward, and he tells it in the sermon that he gave at the translation of Edward's relics. It changes. Sometimes the Danish king is drunk and falls off. But what's always true is that Edward has a vision and sees the Danish king killed just as they were setting out to attack England. So, although Edward didn't exactly do anything here, he has the vision that is able to perceive the defeat of the Danes in that particular way. Perhaps the most important thing he does to get rid of the Danes, though, is not to go to war with them, but simply to become king, thereby replacing a string of three and a half Danish kings. I say half because one of them was actually mothered by a Norman, but 3 Danish kings and then a half Danish king. Edward is now on the throne, and we're back to English kings. We have restored the line of the English, and this is terribly important, of course. Aelred says regarding the reign of Edward, what joy was there then for the English, what universal jubilation, when they saw restored their ancient felicity and the things they had bewailed almost without hope. In Edward, the people received their lost peace, the chief men their renown, and the church its liberty. Then the sun rose and the moon stood still in its orbit as Edward was crowned with glory and honor. The priests shone with sagacity and sanctity. The monasteries were strengthened in all their observances. The clergy stood firm in their duty and the people in their rank. it seemed that even the land was more fruitful, the air healthier, the sun brighter, and the waves of the sea calmer. Since when a peaceful king rules for a long time, everything comes together in a single bond of peace. Then there will be nothing pestilent in the air, nothing tempestuous at sea, nothing unfruitful on land, nothing irregular among the clergy, nothing unruly among the people. A good king assures peace and beauty in the cosmos. No climate change, no hurricanes, no forest fires. The world is wonderful when you have a good king. And he doesn't have to say, and Henry, if you'll keep this in mind, your land will be much happier, because the implication is clear. On one occasion, Edward goes. Now, Edward has a great devotion to St. Peter. But at one point, he goes to the dedication of a church to St. John the Evangelist. And while he's there, a beggar, a pilgrim, comes up to him and asks for a donation. And Edward, who is very kind and is always willing to give to people asking for money, said to his steward who was with him, "Give the man money." And the steward said, "I'm sorry, my lord, I have already emptied out the purse. There is no more money to be had." And the pilgrim says, "Well, it's in honor of St. John." And Edward is so touched by this that he takes off his own ring and gives it to the pilgrim. And the pilgrim thanks him and goes on his way. Some time later, two young Englishmen are in Jerusalem on a kind of tour, apparently. And they're with a group of people, but they get separated from the group. And they're lost in Jerusalem, which is not a good place to be lost in. And they meet an old man of venerable visage, a white beard and white hair. And he says to them, "Young men, can I help you?" And they say, "We're lost. We've lost our tour group." And he says, "Well, why don't you come home with me and have supper and you can spend the night?" And they do. And he says to them, "So where are you from? And who's your king?" And they say, "We're from England and our king is King Edward." And the venerable old man says, "I was there once. And you see this ring? Your king gave it to me. I want you to take it back to him and tell him that he gave his ring to John the Evangelist, and here it is back again. And by the way, you might mention to him that he's going to die before too long. So if he's going to build that church he's been talking about, he should get at it." And so they go home and they give him the ring, and he remembers, and he continues work on Westminster Abbey. This story, which there's some question about where it originated. I think that Aelred himself originated it. This story becomes the origin of the visual epithet of Edward the Confessor. If you go to Westminster Abbey, you'll see pictures in the window of Edward the Confessor with the ring. And you see pictures of Richard II as a king with the ring. So this ring, this story which Aelred tells, is the origin of a tradition that comes down till today. Edward has at one point made a vow to go to Rome. Aelred doesn't himself talk about his trip to Rome, but he has other people pretty interested in going to Rome. So Edward has made a vow to go to Rome, and he finally calls his people together, and he says, "It's time for me. I vowed this a long time ago, and I have to go to Rome now. I'm sorry, but I'm leaving you in good hands. You'll be fine. Just behave well. I'll be back pretty soon, and I have to go." And the people are outraged and distraught because Edward is such a good king that they cannot possibly lose him. And they beg him not to go, and they say that the country will fall apart if he's not there. And he finally says, "Well, let's see what I can do about it." And he writes a letter to the Pope. And the Pope writes back and says, "Well, okay, I'm willing to accept that you'll do something in place of visiting me in Rome." It's interesting that Aelred includes in the work, I've talked about Aelred being a historian and caring about documentation and sources. He includes in the life of Edward 2 of these letters from the Pope allowing Edward to put off his time and to replace his visit to Rome with something else, with the building of Westminster, in fact. So we get the sense of Edward as responsive to the needs of the people, much loved by the people, but also listening to them, responding to them, doing what they want while maintaining his loyalty to the church, while writing to the Pope asking permission to break his vow. This is truly a good king. It's a good model for how a king ought to behave. There are lots of healings, as you would expect in a saint's life. This is a funny work because it's a historical work, but it's a saint's life at the same time. So there's a story of a young woman who has, growths all over her, and she smells terrible. And what's more, she can't conceive a child. Now, it seems to me there's a connection between these two things that Aelred doesn't say anything about. But she is heartbroken, and she smells terrible, and she looks terrible, and her husband won't touch her. And so Aelred heals her and sends her away, and soon enough, she is reunited with her husband and has a child, and the world is a wonderful place. But most of his miracles, a great many of them, have to do with healing the blind. Aelred has a particular interest in this question of healing the blind and seeing the healing of blindness as a purification. It is illuminating people. It is giving them new light, new insight. Edward heals so many blind people that at one point Aelred sort of apologizes about it and says, I know I've been telling you a lot of stories about healing the blind, but I do have just one more I want to tell you. Over and over and over, we get the emphasis that Edward is made so holy by the Holy Spirit that he is able to pass this holiness on to other people, to all these blind people who come to him. In the first 2 cases, however, he is not willing to do it because he's far too humble to go about healing people. And so when the first person comes to him and says, I'm blind, will you help me? He says, not on your life. I don't do that kind of thing. I'm just an ordinary man. And so then he goes to Mass, he washes his hands and goes to Mass, but his servants, recognizing that however sincere he is about this, the man needs to be healed after all. And so they use this wash water and they pour it over the man's eyes. And guess what? He's healed. Well, pretty soon another man shows up and says, I'm blind, will you heal me? And Edward said, no, I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not, I don't do that. And so once again, he goes off to Mass and the servants give the wash water to the man and he washes his face in it. And Aelred exclaims, and lo, a new pool of Siloam has healed him. So Edward is now explicitly connected with the miracle in which Jesus takes his own saliva and mixes it with the dirt and spreads the resulting mud on a blind man's eyes and tells him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash, and thereby he's healed. Aelred is very interested in this connection, that miracle is reflected in the miracles that Edward does to heal the blind. In another miracle, when Westminster Abbey is complete, there's a fisherman in the, fishing outside Westminster Abbey, and he sees a pilgrim on the opposite bank who waves him over and says, I'll pay you if you'll just take me across to where the new church is. Now, this is the night before the blessing of Westminster Abbey. And so he takes the man over, and the man gets out of the boat and goes into Westminster Abbey. And the fisherman watches. and he sees suddenly a heavenly light shines out, illuminating everything in wonderful splendor and turning light into day. With the apostle, because this is Peter, with the apostle was a multitude of celestial citizens entering and leaving, and heavenly melodies sounded as a choir went before them singing hymns. Everything was full of light, everything was filled with sweetness. The joyfulness of the angelic voices delighted the ears, an indescribable fragrance filled the nostrils, and a heavenly light illumined the eyes. Earthly things seemed to have been mingled with heavenly, and human to have been joined to divine, and angels were seen ascending and descending in these sacred rites as if on Jacob's ladder. What more should I say? When everything pertaining to the rites of the dedication of a church had been completed, the great fisher of men returned to the fisher of fish. I don't think that's a very great line, but it is Aelred. So the next day when they entered Westminster Abbey, it had all been consecrated. The candle stubs were where they ought to be, and it was clear that St. Peter himself had blessed the church that St. Edward had built. Finally, as Edward is close to death, he's sitting with the Archbishop of Canterbury and with his wife, and I think with some other people, and he's really very close to death, and he's dozing in and out. And at one point he wakes up and he says to the people who are with him, "When I was a boy in Normandy, some holy men used to be friends of the family, and I spent time with them. Just now, while I was sleeping, 2 of these men appeared to me and began to talk to me." And he says, "And grieving and sighing over the calamity threatening my nation when he dies, I asked them, 'You are familiar with the secrets of heaven. If they are converted and do penance, will God not forgive them and leave his blessing behind?' No, by no means," they said, "because the heart of this people has been hardened. Their eyes have become blind." Notice that line again. If their hearts are hardened, their eyes are blind, and their ears have become dull. They cannot hear the one who is reproaching them or understand the one admonishing them. They are neither frightened by threats nor roused by favors. At these words, my anxiety grew greater. I asked, "And so will God be angry forever? And will he show us his favor no more? When will happiness follow such great sadness?" They said, "When a green tree, having been cut from its trunk and set apart from its own root at the space of 3 yokes, returns to its trunk and is restored to its old root, compelled by no human hand, driven by no necessity, and with its sap restored, flowers again and bears fruit, then some comfort in this tribulation and a remedy for the trouble we have foretold is to be hoped for." When they had said this, they returned to heaven. This is a story that had existed in 2 previous lives of Edward, and in both cases the authors said, "We don't know what that means. That's not going to happen. Nothing has happened to save this people." But Aelred says, "My mind is entirely set against the idea that the calamity was foretold and there was no alleviation." And he goes ahead and he interprets it now, as the 2 previous authors had not been able to say, "The root from which all this honor sprang was the royal seed that descended by a direct line of succession from Aelred, first of the English to be anointed by the Pope, to St. Edward. The tree was cut from the trunk when the kingdom was divided from the royal line and transferred to other seed. The Danes, for example. It was set apart by the space of 3 yokes because during the period of 3 kings, there was no link from the new to the ancient royal seed, for Harold succeeded Edward and William Harold and William the Younger, his father William. The tree returned to its root when the glorious King Henry, to whom the whole honor of the kingdom had been passed, married Matilda, a great niece of Edward, Henry I. The tree flowered when the Empress Matilda came forth from the seed of both, and then it bore fruit when our Henry rose from it like the morning star, joining the 2 peoples like a cornerstone. Now, certainly, England has a king from English stock, and it has bishops and abbots from the same race. It also has princes, the best soldiers too, who have been brought forth from the union of the seed of both races for honor to some and consolation to others. And Aelred concludes this story, this promise, that Henry is in fact the promised leader of England. He says, if this explanation displeases anyone, let him either explain it otherwise or await another time when it may be fulfilled, lest prophet be found to oppose prophet. It is not to be believed that St. Edward refused what we know St. Dunstan promised. And so this work about St. Edward, which is full of miracles he did and what a good king he is, ends by declaring that he and his vision have promised Henry II as the leader of the people, and that Aelred has solved the puzzle that no one else has been able to. And so he leaves the advice inherent in this work that Henry II is the leader of the people chosen by his holy ancestor, with the hope that Henry himself will be as holy and as blessed as has been foretold.